are now experiencing the Muqaddimah podcast, presented by AZ the historian and delivered before a live audience.
Last week's session was very interesting, very insightful, very eventful actually. A lot of learning, a lot of exchange and insight was realized in that session. And we will continue in the same line of discussion. The spiritual realm, the other side, beyond the visible, the tangible, the material, the other realm that human beings at times have access to through the medium of either sorcery and magic or through spirituality. And for the sake of this discussion today, we will talk of Tasawwuf. Tasawwuf, the spiritual discipline that enables men and women to have a higher connection with the other world, effectively. We will, as we have done in the previous episodes, go through the Muqaddimah, picking a specific chapter and page, and we will break it down, discuss it, and have an exchange based on that, inshallah. So I will begin by introducing the topic, the origins and the spiritual dimensions of Tasawwuf. The origins and the spiritual dimensions of Tasawwuf. This is the most befitting title given the fact that Ibn Khaldun begins by telling us about the origins of Tasawwuf. It's a very, very big talking point. In fact, when we talk of Tasawwuf, Sufism, amongst Muslims, one of the main talking points is the origins of Tasawwuf. Does this practice, this system, originate from Islam, number one? Number two, does it come from the early generations of Islam, or is it a later addition into Islamic theory and practice? So the origin theory of Tasawwuf is addressed by Ibn Khaldun, which is perfect. The second aspect is the spiritual dimensions of Tasawwuf. Okay, what is Tasawwuf? Where does it lead to? What does it require of the person? So we're going to be talking to these 2 points here: the origins and the dimensions of Tasawwuf, inshallah. So let's begin. Ibn Khaldun says in the chapter talking about Tasawwuf, because it's an entire chapter. Okay, we're going to we're going to connect last week's session to the current week's session, because Ibn Khaldun mentions to us here that there are people from the sorcery, from those who practice sorcery, who train themselves. There are people who train themselves. Okay, so sorcery, magic, is something that people have to practice. As I said last week, many of us from the Western Hemisphere, we tend to be very uneasy when the issue of the unseen is mentioned. And I've seen it in the last week. It's difficult for people to accept that there is an unseen element of what we see in the world, in the real world. There are unseen dimensions that certain people tap into and utilize. It's very difficult to accept from a Western paradigm because we are conditioned, whether we acknowledge it or not, we are conditioned to reject these discussions because it is not scientific. And so by conditioning, social conditioning, we reject them. But the reality is there is a dimension out there that is not detectable by the 5 senses. And as I said in the previous session, to think that everything there is to know has to be detectable by the 5 senses, by the sight, sound, sensation, or smell, that in itself is a shortcoming in the human brain. To imagine that everything there is to know has to be filtered through your own limited senses. No, there is a lot more out there. And there are many people who make a living, who make it their life's mission to master these sciences, to find portals and ways to connect to the other dimension. And Ibn Khaldun is telling us here that when it comes to sorcery, people train themselves in this. It is a discipline, a tradition. I gave an example in the previous session that in the same way you find people who pray to God, people who recite sacred scripture, people who fast, people who purify themselves. There are also people on the other side of the spectrum who do the opposite. We know there are people who are religious, who pray to God, who recite scripture. Well, if that is accepted, and we know that's a reality, why is it difficult to conceive of the opposite of that? which is there are people who don't do that, but do the opposite, who venerate demons, who conjure up spirits, who perform rituals towards malevolent spirits. It is possible. So he's telling us here very clearly that there are people who do this, and they are very proficient in this, and they train themselves in these things. There are methods. There is a protocol for how to get in touch with, for example, the jinns. There are hierarchies. There are processes and stages that you have to go through in order to make connection with these malevolent spirits. And this is a reality. This is a reality. It's not something that is just fantasy, make-believe. It's a reality. Now, he traces much of this to certain zones. If you remember, the Muqaddimah begins with the 7 climbs, the 7 zones. And that was important because everything else that comes afterwards in the Muqaddimah is going to be presented from that perspective, the 7 zones of the earth. He has his own theories, his own mechanism, but that is important to understand. So here he's telling us about the intemperate zones, those zones that are very cold in the north and those that are very hot towards the south. And he talks of India and the yogis being amongst those people who train themselves to attain supernatural powers and to tap into that realm. So this was knowledge known to Ibn Khaldun in his day and age. So the Far East and the spiritual traditions of the Far East was known to the people at the time. And it's very important because when we talk of Tasawwuf, Sufism, there are very prevalent claims and theories about the connection between Tasawwuf in Islam and Eastern tradition. And we're going to get into that shortly, inshallah. So he identifies the yogis are amongst the people who train to reach that level. And in his book, Sorcery, we had a question in the previous session concerning yoga. Well, here is your answer. Okay. Somebody said, what about yoga? This is an answer in that that system as a holistic system is also part of the process of training yourself with this spiritual exercise. And he says in India, the yogis do this. Okay? It doesn't mean that the physical exercise itself, just the exercise itself, is a form of shirk or sorcery, but the system within which the exercise is created and finds a home is a system of spiritual training. And there are people who spend their entire lives, the yogis, for example, doing that. Now, in the real world, as I've mentioned in the previous session, in the 60s, for example, there was a massive trend of Westerners going to the East and picking up esoteric cults and gurus and yogis and coming back to the West and practicing this and popularizing this. One example given was the Beatles, the very famous group, the Beatles. They were dabbling in and out of these sorts of different Eastern cults. I think at one point they actually had a yogi. He became very famous, right?
Far from the noise and pace of city life, in the cool, clear air of Rishikesh, North India, Pathé News reports from the meditation retreat of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the man who, through transcendental meditation, is currently bringing peace of mind to the Beatles. Flower-loving Yogi told reporters that his brand of peace of mind could only be truly appreciated by intelligent men of the world with rewarding activities and high incomes. Among his most valued disciples were the Beatles, top of the pop pupils. He did his best to keep them away from outsiders, but George had a way for us. Keeping company with himself, it could be part of the treatment, John stalked along the shady paths. Ringo enjoyed the peace of togetherness with Mrs. Ringo. It was a very peaceful scene. So different from those not so far off times when just a glimpse of the Beatles was enough to ruin the meditation chances of anyone within earshot. Ah, those were the days. Now, 2 by 2, the world-famous quartet strolled quietly in the lovely meditation preserve. Paul and Ringo shed the cares of their successful world. Close behind, George and John, complete with blanket for even more peace.
So they popularized this. And in the West, the young generation were dabbling and experimenting in Eastern philosophy. Some of them also went to the Muslim world and became Sufis. There are very great examples of this, who took on this and became Sufis. In fact, Ibn Khaldun's biographer in the English language, the intellectual biography of Ibn Khaldun, the author of that was one of those people who in that epoch left the European Western civilization and found himself, I think he went to Morocco or Algeria, but he went to North Africa and he became a Sufi. And if you read his, he died a couple of years ago, his obituary, it mentions he went looking for a spiritual adventure. At a time when people were going to the East for knowledge of the other side of the world and the spiritual realms, he decided to go into Islamic spirituality, and he became a faqir. A faqir. He became a. And this is something that actually, as he writes about Ibn Khaldun, it actually characterizes his perspective on Islam a lot. Okay, his worldview and how he expresses Islam. So it's very powerful. It's very powerful. So that is to say, sorcery, magic, the demonic realm, contacting spirits. This is a profession. This is a calling. This is a discipline that is well established globally and is practiced in the same way you have an alim in Islamic science who would go through various stages, studying sacred text, memorizing, going through tarbiyah, tasfiyah, tazkiyah, to purify themselves, to cultivate certain traits within themselves, to be a carrier of sacred knowledge. There are people who are doing the opposite of that, who are going through the opposite stage of becoming sorcerers. Okay, and from the experience I've had across the other part of the world, the non-Western world, it's a reality. Okay, there are people who become apprentices to sorcerers, and it's a part of their training. In the same way, somebody becomes an engineer, and they go through a stage process where they go through apprenticeship. Those who practice sorcery have apprentices, and I can tell you that as a matter of fact. It's not something that I think I read somewhere. It's a matter of fact. Okay, again, it's based on a different perspective from a different part of the world. So Ibn Khaldun then says, on the other side of the equation, we have the Sufi. And the Sufi goes through the same spiritual training, preparation, regime, exercise, routine. However, his routine is different because it's religious. It's a dini. It is a religious one. It is one entrenched. When he says religious one, he means Islamic. So in the same way, you have somebody who trains to be an athlete, or trains to be a wrestler, a boxer for a professional title. There are other people who train physically to do what? To kill. They train in the gym to gain muscle and strength so they can kill, or so they can damage, so they can harm people. So in the same way the gym is a neutral place for training the body, there are neutral zones in the spiritual realm where you can train the spirit. Some people train their spirit to build, to develop, to heal, to help, to guide, to assist. Others develop the spirit to destroy, to harm, to possess, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is something that is known. So the Sufi is on the other side. He's going to the gym to become a better helper. He's going to the gym to utilize whatever he gets in the spiritual realm to help, to develop, to guide people. So he says religious training. It is free from any such reprehensible intentions. In other words, although some of the means may look similar and they are dabbling in the same realms, the spiritual realm, the Sufi has good intentions, okay, according to Ibn Khaldun. The Sufi aspires to total concentration upon God and upon the approach to Him in order to obtain the mystical experiences, gnosis, right, or knowledge of God. So this mystical experience in the Sufi terminology has many words. There are many expressions, adhawq being one of them. Adhawq. Adhawq is to taste. In other words, there is an experience in the spiritual realm and dimension that you don't just get to experience because you're a Muslim. No, you need to go through training to a certain degree where you can begin to taste adhawq, this taste. And in an extreme form, it becomes intoxication. The Sufi becomes intoxicated, okay? So these are spiritual dimensions, that there are manuals for this. There are programs for this. There are teachers and guides for this that will guide you through the stages, the maqamat. You go through a spiritual journey and they are guiding you through it. So you can get to the point where you can begin to taste al-dhawq. You begin to taste. And this tasting is not something that is sensory in the sense of tasting. What it means is you will see things. You will perceive things. You will experience things. You will hear things that come from the other realm. And there is a long list of books and manuals and teachers and schools and madhahib and systems to help you get there. Okay? And that's a long story. We don't have time to get into all of that. It's been written about to the extent to which there's not enough time to read all the books and to even mention the titles. One of the trainings, which is I found quite interesting here, because it's practiced not only by the Sufi, but you find across various spiritual traditions, this is also practiced, including the sorcerers, and that is to deprive yourself of food and drink. In other words, fasting. Fasting is one of the ways that the spiritual, you could say, traveler attains their objective, to stop eating and drinking, right? And in the case of the Sufi, to make dhikr, or what we call wird, certain formulas that they recite again and again and again and again, certain formulas.
Allah, 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 ya
Now you could imagine on the flip side of that, the magician is doing the same thing. So he will go into a room, something known as khalwa, which is to seclude yourself. Oftentimes in dirty places. For example, you'll go into a cemetery at night, or you'll go into a cave for a number of days, or you'd lock yourself in a room full of darkness. And they would also chant and incant certain formulas. These are principles and rules and systems that are practiced by various systems. And likewise, you find, for example, some of the in the Far East, in the Buddhist tradition, in some of the Jain traditions and Hindu traditions, that they don't eat for a long time. Part of their training is they don't eat for a long time. They don't speak for a long time. They abstain from things for a long time. All of this is part of the spiritual conditioning. Okay, the Sufis have a share in that as well. Except for, in their case, they use dhikr, the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the ayat of Quran is their form of, as I said, they feed on that. So while they're hungry, they feed on that to sustain them, to prepare them. So, and again, a lot of this can be broken down. There is a lot more to it than just this. Gives you an idea to that. So what is the objective of all of this? What is the goal of all of this? At the end of the road, when you get through this process of purifying yourself, putting yourself in spiritual ecstasy and suffering hunger and isolation, what is the objective? The objective is one of two dimensions. The first one is what we know as ma'rifah. And this is a Greek term, gnosis, which means to know something. It is the knowledge of something, right? So the Sufi wants to come to the point where he gets to know God, right? Knowledge of God. Ma'rifah, he recognizes God. And this has many manifestations, many stages. Whereas the sorcerer, he is getting closer to the demon. To the demon, he actually is either calling, he's conjuring up, or he's praying towards or sacrificing towards. That demon would appear to that person and would be in that person's service, and they have a contract. Okay, so on either end of this, the objective is to come to contact with a supernatural spirit, be it an angel, be it a demon, right? But to come to contact and to have knowledge of that realm, intimate knowledge, ma'rifah. Somebody who reaches that level becomes an arif, somebody who gets to know, like he's witnessed, he knows the other thing. So, I mean, there is a lot there, but this is where the two have a connection in that they are both in the spirit realm. There are systems there are manuals, there are terms and terminologies. There is a system by which the initiate goes through to attain this spiritual development. Except that the intention is different. One, as I said before, goes to the gym to strengthen his body so he can become a professional athlete, for example, or to be somebody who can help others who are weak. The other goes to the gym to destroy people, to beat people up, to rob people, to become a more dangerous member of society. But the gym remains the gym, nevertheless. The weights are still the weights. That doesn't change. It's the intention and the means that they seek to take through that gym membership. So, gnosis, or let's use the Arabic word that Ibn Khaldun have used, ma'rifa. Ma'rifa. This is to know, right? To really know the reality behind the reality. So, the objective of the Sufi and Tasawwuf is to go beyond the obvious, al-Zahir. Al-Zahir. I'm going to bring a few terms here because Ibn Khaldun, he wrote this book for a certain audience. A certain audience. He's not going to spell everything out and give you the breakdown because he expects you to already know that before you get into the book. So when you come to terms of what he explains here, you should already know what's happening. So he doesn't have to explain everything. But for the benefit of this audience, I'm going to break it down to give us a good head start so we can understand where he's going with this. It's very dense, very deep stuff. So the objective of the Sufi ultimately is to get to know God. All right? So let me give you an example here. Let's imagine I introduce you to an art gallery. You enter the art gallery, and on every wall, all you can see are beautiful paintings. All you can see are beautiful paintings on every wall. Now, some people walk into a room, they see the paintings, and it doesn't bother them. They don't even stop to look at it. They're busy looking at the television, what's up for dinner. They're distracted. They can see there are paintings in the house, they're beautiful, but they don't pay attention to it. They are heedless. And throughout, they may live in that house for 10 years and they never think about the painting. Who painted this? I wonder how they look like. I mean, they don't consider it, they just see it as a painting, it's a decoration, and they live their lives. There are others who walk into a room and immediately they notice this painting is specific in its style, in the way it's been designed, and it is most certainly done by a master. There's craftsmanship here. There is insight, there is wisdom, there is imagination, there is originality, there is brilliance here. I need to know who the painter is. You see? So that person is now going to go on a mission to try to find a way to get close to the painter. The painting is just a means to the painter. So when they see the painting, all they see is they can see the painter behind the painting, but they now want to get to know him or her, right? So who's the painter? So that journey brings us to a conclusion, a destination known as gnosis or ma'rifa. You come to know the artist or the author behind the painting. That's the ultimate objective. So the Sufi, he understands religion, he understands prayer, he understands fasting. These are like paintings on the wall. But what she really wants is to know the painter. Okay? And then there are we get into a lot of deep waters there when we talk, for example, there's ma'rifa, and then you have at the highest level unification, fana, and it gets quite complicated at that point and quite controversial as well. But they're looking for the ultimate source of everything, and that's where the Sufi is working towards. Okay? They don't want to just see the painting; they want to know the painter behind the painting. And so this is the objective here for the spiritual exercise, is to go beyond the visible. Again, the visible things in this world are obstacles for us. Some of us, we stop at the first obstacle. All we get to see and experience are visible and tangible things like children. We don't go beyond that. We're stuck on level one, physical, tangible. Therefore, if it's not physical, if it's not tangible, it doesn't exist. That's a very, very primitive, very, very basic mindset to have. There are things in this world that just by looking at them, they point you towards greater things that you don't see. There are things in this world, just by observing and looking at them, they should point you to things that are greater and unseen. If you think, أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ, don't they think? أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ, don't they contemplate? Right? This is why I said now Ibrahim, when he looked at the stars, when he looked at the sun, When he looked at the moon, it pointed him to greater things. And ultimately, he came to the conclusion there is something greater than all of this, the creator of the heavens and the earth. And he went on a journey. Okay. So this is what the objective is for the Sufi, is to go beyond the apparent, beyond the physical acts of ritual, beyond all of that. But it's not only for the Sufi. This is something that across world tradition, if you look at Buddhism, for example, Christianity, you look at Judaism, Hinduism, they all have a tradition of spirituality. They all have a tradition of seeking the truth, beyond the evidence. And they all have a tradition that, in some sense, is Tasawwuf. And that's going to open another question here. Okay? That's another very interesting question. There's a debate amongst some of the theologians and scholars whether Tasawwuf is actually from Islam or not. Is it something that came before Islam and took an Islamic flavor, or is it distinctively Islamic? And this is what Ibn Khaldun is going to tell us about in the following section here. So, from the very beginning, the science of Sufism, as in the same way he talks of the science of the dark arts, the science of sorcery, it was a science for him. Tasawwuf is a science. And he begins, the very first phrase he says is, this science belongs to the sciences of the religious law that originated in Islam. Right? So when he says religious law here, he is a jurist, he's a faqih. When he says law, and whenever you read law in the Muqaddimah, in the English translation, it means fiqh, jurisprudence. So this one sentence encompasses maybe 10 pages that you could go on spelling 10 pages about where does it come from. He makes it very simple because as a scholar, he's addressing other scholars and students of knowledge. He's telling them, I know the questions that scholars and students of knowledge have concerning Tasawwuf. So I'm going to give you in the most brief and concise and loaded way, the answers straight away. So with this one sentence, he has answered maybe something that could have taken us 10 hours to get into. He says very clearly, this science is a discipline. So it is established. It has a root, a foundation, and branches. It is a science. That's the first takeaway. It belongs to the sciences of religious law. So in the same way you have Hadith science, you have Sharia, which is fiqh effectively. He says there is also Tasawwuf. It belongs to these sciences. So we have two things already. Then he adds a third component. He says it originated in Islam. SubhanAllah. These 3 points alone have taken people years just discussing, researching, debating, writing about, lecturing, studying. It's an ocean. In one sentence, he gives us 3 statements. It is a science that has foundations, that has branches, it has roots, and it has fruits. It is from the religious law, and it is from Islam. So the claim that this Tasawwuf came from outside of Islam, he's saying, nope, it is from Islam. It originated from Islam. So he's rebuking the idea that Tasawwuf came from the ancient, for example, Hindus, as some people claim, or the ancient Greeks within the esoteric orders, or the ancient Buddhists, as some people claim, or even the Zoroastrians, as some people claim. He says, no, it comes from Islam. It is in the science and the religious laws of Islam. So now he has to, having made those statements, he has to explain to us and give us some supporting evidence. So he begins by saying, and I want you to pay attention to the wonderful, the way he constructs his sentences. Because again, these are scholars of high learning and understanding. They don't write just for descriptive value only. They write with meticulous attention to detail. Every word is placed in its proper place. There's an economy of words and expression and a precision. That is, when you understand the level to which they're actually writing, it's an amazing thing to read their works because every word, every sentence is constructed in a way that is precise, succinct, and very, very relevant. This could have taken 2 pages or 3 pages or 4 pages just for the first line, but he makes it very simple. He makes a truth statement followed by backing evidence straight after that, right? So he goes, after having claimed this from Islam and from the sciences, he says, Sufism is based on the assumption that the method of those people who came later has always been considered important, considered by the important and early Muslims. The men around Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the men of the second generation, as well as those that came after them, as the path of truth and guidance. Now, this is quite loaded because what he's saying here is that Tasawwuf, yes, he's acknowledging that Tasawwuf as a science, as a discipline, even the term Tasawwuf came later. What he's saying is very important. It came later. So he's not claiming that this was something that existed in the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam or his companions. He's saying it came later. However, and this is a very fine detail, the essence, the origin, the principles of Tasawwuf were always there. It just did not have a name at that time. It just did not have a name at that time. Now, I'm not advocating for this. Neither am I begrudging it. I'm just giving you the interpretation as he's writing it here. He's telling you Tasawwuf or Sufism did not exist in the form and in the name that we know it today at the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam or his companions. It did not exist. However, the essence of Tasawwuf, the meaning and the what we call lub, as Allah said in the Quran, ulul albab, the inner reality of Tasawwuf was always there in the first generation of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then the tabi'in and atba tabi'in. So in other words, what he's saying is, it is not an innovation. It has not been innovated. It's just been developed. In the same way, for example, somebody could say to you, I'm a Sunni. Well, I could say to you, well, Sunniism did not exist in the lifetime of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the way we know it today. There was no Maliki madhab, or Shafi'i madhab, or Hanafi madhab, or Hanbali madhab, or Athari creed madhab. They didn't exist in that time. There was no formulaic base by which to define Sunniism at that time. Nevertheless, we would all agree as Sunnis, this way was the way of the Prophet ﷺ's companions. He just didn't have a name, and the books were not written yet. So what he's saying is that in the same way that those claims can be true, so too is the claim that Sufism existed in essence, but it was developed later on. Okay? So again, this is something that is heavily debated. People go in and out. There is a lot of evidence on both sides. But the premise is it's not innovated, and it comes from Islam. Those who talk of Tasawwuf originating from Islam oftentimes have one hadith, a very famous hadith that they quote as a source of Tasawwuf, and the foundation, the blueprint of this system comes from that very one famous hadith.
Is it the Hadith of Jibreel?
Yes. Okay, so the hadith of Jibreel is very famous. It's the second hadith in the Arba'in an-Nawawiyah. One of the most foundational pillars of Islam. When we talk of the most famous and most powerful and most relevant hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ is one of them, and the hadith Jibreel is another one, and there's a third one. Does anyone know the third hadith? If we lost every hadith in the collection that we have in the Sunni tradition, but we only had 3 hadith left, that would be sufficient according to hadith masters. What are the 3 hadith? The first one is إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. The second one is hadith Jibreel. What's the third hadith? I'm testing you now. What's the third hadith? If you lost every hadith and you only had 3 left to rely upon, I've given you the first. What's the third hadith?
Is it maybe the one من حسن إسلام المرء ترك ما لا يعني? If the best of people's Islam is you speak leaving off what doesn't concern you.
The third, it's a good, but this is not about the creed. It's about
right, creed.
Yeah, it's about creed. If you have to reconstruct or you have to principle your creed upon 3 hadith alone, I've given you the first 2, actions by intentions, and the hadith Jibreel. There's a third hadith.
The third is the pillars again, and then the fourth is in al-halal bayn wa al-haram bayn.
Yes, halal is bayin. What is halal is clear. What is haram is clear. And those who, there was one about innovation basically. Those who add to this thing of ours, Islam, that which was not known of outside will be fahuwarad, will be rejected from them.
Yes.
That is a foundational principle hadith when it comes to creed and jurisprudence, which is why whenever we talk about the Tasawwuf and other, we have to look at it through that perspective. Is this an innovation? Because that hadith is a foundational hadith for everything we do with our ibadat. Is it from Islam or not? Rasul said, if it's not from Islam, it's فَهُوَ رَدْ. So it's a very, very strong. So Ibn Khaldun says it is from Islam, the essence. So now the essence, let's go back to the second hadith, is Jibreel appeared and he says, Ya Muhammad, tell me, أخبرني عن الإسلام. Actually, the actual order is أخبرني عن الإيمان first. Iman came first, then Islam, then Ihsan. And so the Prophet ﷺ is teaching his community. A man appears out of nowhere and interrupts the lesson and says, tell me, O Muhammad, what is belief? And he says to him, ﷺ, belief is 6 pillars. And he tells him all the 6 pillars. To believe in God, the angels, the books, the messengers, the day of judgment, heaven, hell, destiny, and ordainment, the good and the bad, and resurrection, right? These are the things, these are the what. What do you have to believe to be a Muslim? These are the whats, okay? The what. What do you have to believe to be Muslim? 6 things in principle. There are more, but these are the 6 things. Then he says, أخبرني عن الإسلام. Now tell me about Islam. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, Islam, بني الإسلام على خمسة. Islam is built upon 5. So the first thing is to the Shahada, testimony of faith. This is an action, it's an action. Then the prayers, then fasting, then zakah, then hajj. So the man asked him, in that case, tell me the third question, what is ihsan? Ihsan is to perfect something. It's the height of something, the completion of something. So distinction. So you've told me now what Islam is, so what I have to believe. You've told me the how to worship once I believe. These are the 5 actions. Tell me now, like the inner, like what makes this perfect, like the inner meaning and the perfection, the highest level. What is ihsan? And the Prophet ﷺ says, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه, that you worship Allah as if you see him. And if you do not see him, you are cognizant of the fact that he sees you. This is the highest level. So the first level of Islam then is about belief, what you believe in. This is why somebody, I don't want to give you a crash course on Islam. I want to paint the picture so you can understand. The foundation principle of Islam is belief. It's about what a person believes in. This is why somebody can say, La ilaha illallah. They may not pray all the time. They may not wear the hijab, but they're still a Muslim, according to the majority of Muslims, because they believe. So these are the 6 things you have to believe in to be Muslim. Okay, fine. Now that I believe, what do I have to do? Here are the 5 things you have to do, the 5 pillars. Fine. Now that I've done the outward actions of praying and fasting, going to Hajj and giving zakah and making shahada, what is the next level? And this is where Tasawwuf comes into it. What is the next level? It doesn't stop with actions. What is the next level, the highest level? And the Prophet says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when you worship God, you do it in a state as if you could see him. And if you can't reach that level of realization and knowledge and cognition, that at least you worship him as if he can see you, or you know that he can see you. So this is where Tasawwuf comes into it. Tasawwuf says, or the principle or the theology of Tasawwuf is that actions alone are not enough. The actions alone of praying, fasting, going to Hajj is not enough. It's a medium, but it's not the destination. In order for you to reach the highest level of Islam, you need to go through a spiritual journey. You need to go beyond the actions and get to the reality behind the reality. And this is where Tasawwuf comes into it. So when Ibn Khaldun said Tasawwuf came, even in the early epoch, he's talking about this. The ethos, the dimension beyond the actions, the spiritual dimension that we can go beyond this. There is a greater reality behind the actions. And we want to reach that, is what he's talking about here. That existed at the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this hadith is always cited as an evidence for that, which is why in the books of Sufi scholars, they have this hadith broken down. Sharia, Tariqah, Haqiqah. So Islam had 3 levels: belief, action, and then realization. Imagine the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the very bottom are the physiological needs, eating, drinking. At the very highest level, the peak of it is actualization. is when you want to go beyond just the mere survival instinct and to satisfy your ego and lust. You want to go beyond all of that and reach enlightenment. So Islam has three pillars, has three stages. Islam is at the bottom. That's level one. We can all pray and fast. Then you have tariqah. So Islam is governed by Sharia. So Islam, which is how to pray, how to fast, these are governed by halal haram rulings. Sharia, the book, the text, the law. Then the second stage is tariqah. This is when you get into a bit more of an enlightened stage and you go on a journey. So you need a path. So tariqah is a path, is a pathway you go upon to reach a destination. And the final stage is either sometimes known as ma'rifah or haqiqah, which is the reality, the truth. You now reach the truth. And that's where the realm of Tasawwuf, that's where the realm of Tasawwuf actually resides in. For those who want to go beyond just the praying and fasting and want to reach the ultimate truth, the secrets behind these actions and the secrets behind this experience of being a human being, and to reach the infinite, and to basically, when you reach the highest level, again, it gets very complicated because the terminology is the language, it's very complicated. But you reach a point where you are annihilated. And this term in Islamic term is called al-fana. Al-fana. And al-fana, according to the ancient scriptures, even Ibn Khaldun mentions it in his Muqaddimah, it has been derived from the Hindu and Buddhist tradition. Nirvana. Nirvana, nirvana in English. Nirvana, fana. Fana, to be annihilated. Or what we call today in modern speech, modern terminology, amongst the pseudo spiritual movements in the West, ego death. When you are no longer yourself, you are completely vaporized, you have melted into the ether, you have been completely engulfed by reality, you forget yourself, and you are part of the greater reality. And now that gets very complicated. It gets really abstract and very difficult and very dangerous in many cases. It can lead to certain dimensions that we don't want to end up in as Muslims. So that is what he's talking about here. And then he says, these things were general among the men around Muhammad and the early Muslims. General in that they didn't have a system for it. There wasn't a book known as the Book of Sufism. There wasn't a tariqah. There wasn't a school. There wasn't a method. They naturally had spirituality at that time. They were naturally spiritual. They were naturally inquisitive. They were naturally pure souls and spirits. They were naturally people who were inclined to the higher things and the higher ideals, and used to pray at night, and used to fast regularly, and used to seek the face of God. So naturally, they didn't need to have a system. So these things were there naturally. But later on, it had to be developed, codified, schools were introduced, teachers introduced, books introduced. It became Sufism as a brand, effectively, and as a specific subject. You had to study it. So his argument really here is that, yeah, we can't say Sufism existed in the form that we know it in the early phase, but we can argue that it was always there. It was natural for them. They didn't have to go through a system to learn how to do the things. It was just naturally there because they were the first generation. They were direct disciples of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They saw him, met him. They had the barakah of being with him sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and therefore they had spiritual insight that the rest of us have to train to get. For them, is natural. You know, for example, when we talk of athletes from certain parts of the world, from the highlands or from places where it's easier to become an athlete. So, for example, Ethiopia and the Ethiopian hills and the Ethiopian sprinters and runners and marathon runners. It is easier for them because the environment they live in and their genetic makeup is perfectly suited for this kind of activity. The way they are built, the way they live, where they live, their traditions, makes it a lot easier for them to excel in these sports. But somebody who comes from somewhere else has to train a lot harder to attain the same level of proficiency. So what he's saying here is that in the early phase of Islam, those people, because of who they were, where they were, the time they were in, came naturally for them. But for the rest of us, we have to go through training, spiritual training, to attain that level of insight. And that is why Sufism was codified later on. So then he mentions to us a starting point. And it's very interesting here. He says, then the dunya, or the worldly aspirations increased in the 2nd century. So in the 2nd Hijri century, which is in this in the Gregorian calendar is the 8th century, Tasawwuf became a thing at that point because of the worldly developments. And this is important because when we talk of Tasawwuf, there is a theory that Tasawwuf emerged as a result of excessive materialism. When in the 8th century, that would have been the epoch of the Abbasids. They came into power in 750. So the 8th century, at the turn of that century, the Abbasid really came into power. And then we have Baghdad. Then we have the Enlightenment. Then we have the Golden Discovery. So he's saying here that at that moment, when the Muslims became very opulent, very, very materially blessed, and they had a lot of material and resource, Tasawwuf became a necessity. People have to balance the materialism with more spirituality. And so you found people now preaching about spirituality and warding people against materialism. And that is how Sufism as a school, as a science, began to be codified. And he is actually right, because the early proponents, some of the earliest teachers of Tasawwuf, the names, the biggest names, came from where? Some of the biggest names, can somebody tell me, some of the biggest, which city do they come from generally? Or were they known to have lived and taught?
Baghdad.
That, exactly. Baghdad. There's a reason for that. So
And
this
Ustad, if I could ask a quick question, you mentioned the 750 AD. What generation was that from the first 3 generations? Were they about in that time frame?
Tabi'in and Atba
Yeah.
Tabi'in.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Tabi'in, Atba Tabi'in, exactly. So he's saying here that at that generation, there was Sufism because there was a lot of development materially. And in order to counter the corruption of materialism, there was a need for the scholars of that time to introduce spirituality. So Tasawwuf became a means by which they could save people's spirits when they were drowning in material wealth and resource. So that's interesting because in the timeline, that's the Abbasid era. That's when it begins in Baghdad. And Baghdad at that time, at its very height, had 1 million inhabitants. That's unheard of in the ancient world. 1 million inhabitants in a city, a walled city, right? That's massive. So they had a lot of wealth and they were receiving Greek manuscripts, Hindu manuscripts, Roman manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts, Chinese manuscripts. The people flocking to Baghdad. So it became materialistic and very rigid in terms of science. So to purify and to break that cycle, spirituality came forward and became something that people began to teach about. That's why you find the biggest names in Tasawwuf either were born, taught, or buried in Baghdad. Yeah, it was the epicenter of that movement. So then he mentions, now where do we get the term Sufism? So if he says to us Sufism did not exist as a term, as a school, as a book, as a system in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we only had Islam. Where do we get this term Sufism from? Where does it come from? There are many, many theories as to where Sufi, the word Sufi or Sufism comes from. Many, many theories, but it's not really unanimous. It's not unanimous. There are various perspectives. It's not unanimous. The most popular terms and theories given, Al-Qurayshi, for example, a linguist, says, there is no etymology or analogy that can be found for this term in Arabic. In other words, it does not originate from the Arabic language per se, proper. However, it may be a nickname given, something that was developed to describe a people that arose at that time. So theories developed. One of them being Tasawwuf comes from the word as-safa, purity, something pure, sincere, right? Serene, something clean. So that is perhaps where this term came from, to describe those people who are pure, who purify themselves, right? That's one theory. Another one is as-sufa, the veranda or the bench. And this is important because we know in the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ, in fact, there was a diagram here. There's a diagram of the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ, wherein there is a segment area. This is the mosque, a reconstruction of it, the early mosque in Medina. This section here is known as As-Sufa, the veranda, because this is where those converts to Islam who didn't have anywhere to live, no family, they were dispossessed, they were impoverished, they lived here full time in the mosque. And they spent all of their time, because they were actually impoverished and had no family connections or they were dispossessed, they spent most of their time worshipping, learning religion, and becoming effectively a class of people who dedicated themselves almost full time to worship and learning. And so this became a school in Medina, As-Sufa, Ahlus Sufa. And so one theory is that Sufism comes from that term, Sufa. Okay? That's one theory. And the third theory is As-Saf, As-Safa. Yeah? And the Quran has a chapter called As-Safa, Sufuf, rows. As in when you're praying, you stand in rows. Again, to denote the religiosity of these people. So these are all just theories. There's no solid foundation for it. It's just theories. And another theory is that it comes from As-Suf, As-Suf, which means wool. And this is quite interesting because As-Suf, or wool, was something that they were known for. Apparently, these early adherents to Sufism used to dress in woolen cloaks, in very simple attire, cheap attire, and people came to know them by this uniform effectively. And in, for example, in Hollywood, we have, so this attire that they're wearing would resemble, to this very day, by the way, those who are typically known as Sufis. They have this cloak that they wear. George Lucas actually took inspiration, literally, from Sufi brotherhoods, both in America and then in North Africa. So when he was writing this and preparing this, he took a lot of inspiration from Sufism, even in the dress that they wear. He's supposed to be a Sufi master, a murshid. And you know the statement, may the force be with you, Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. And he's the old man who's teaching them about the other, like the spirit realm or the hidden powers. You need to concentrate the inner truth of things, and they become Jedis and they have these powers. It is loosely based upon Tasawwuf. And George Lucas was known when he was in America, as in his younger years, to dabble and to go into these circles of young converts to Islam who were themselves on a spiritual journey practicing Tasawwuf. And so from there, he got an insight into Tasawwuf theology, theory, practice, and put it to work in his movies. Okay, so there we have an example of Tasawwuf. So this, what they're wearing here, is a sort of cloak. You look online, Google, Holy Man, Islam, Sufi, they wear these sorts of cloaks. And they came to be known by this. So another theory is that Sufi comes from the term Suf, which means wool, which describes the uniform they used to wear. Okay. All of these are theories. Neither of them can be fully established, but it is a theory that is taken into consideration. So Sufism, he says, comes from Islam. However, the reason why he says this is because there are people within Islam and outside of Islam who have claimed otherwise, who have said that Sufism actually is not from Islam. It predates Islam. It comes from other spiritual traditions, from Christianity, from Judaism, right? From the mysticism in the East. And the Sufis were influenced by these scriptures that came into Baghdad, and they adapted from that and developed their own theology and their own practices. Now, what makes it quite interesting is because some of the terms they use in Sufism, for example, fana, it comes from nirvana, 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 fana. They did borrow, in later writings, they did borrow from other traditions. You also have the perennialist school of thought, the perennialist school of thought, which actually talks of all religions having a common truth and reality. All religions throughout space and time have a common essence, a common truth, a common reality. Therefore, from all traditions, we can find the path to God. It's quite a popular belief in modern circles today. And some Muslims actually have this belief, perennialism. But the idea is that Tasawwuf is a form of perennialism because it's borrowing from other ancient traditions and just halalifying it, Islamifying. But in essence, it comes from other traditions. In the Far East, for example, in Jewish mysticism, in Christian mysticism, Gnosis, and ancient Greek, because all of these texts were coming to Baghdad. and they were certainly reading about them. And so that's one very, very significant, and I would not dismiss the theory, quite frankly, because even Ibn Khaldun has addressed it here by saying, no, actually, it's from Islam. Okay, it's not from outside of Islam, it's from Islam. There are groups today, contemporary groups, who are Sufis, but are not Muslim. There are groups today in the West who are Sufis, and they'll say, we are Sufis, but they will say to you, we are not Muslims. How can that be? Their claim is that Sufism transcends Islam. Sufism is like a system of belief spirituality that encompasses all traditions from all the great religions. It's beyond one religion. It's beyond prayer and fasting. It's about the reality behind the reality. So they claim Sufism, but they don't claim Islam. And that idea actually gives credence again to the claim that Sufism may have been something that was inspired from other traditions. Some Muslims took on some of the ideas. And there are, to be honest with you, there are certain ideas that you can see the trace, okay? The maqamat, the stages of enlightenment, for example. You go through stages of enlightenment. There's a path, a suluk, a journey you go upon. Let's be honest, okay? It's not from Islam. In terms of the scripture, it's not in the Quran or the Sunnah. So it's coming from somewhere. And when we look at the other traditions, there are a lot of correlative causes to believe that actually, yeah, it's common. Let's look at the correlative causes here. It's very similar to the journey that you take as a spiritual, somebody seeking the truth in Buddhism, for example, the Four Noble Truths, sitting down, suffering, getting enlightenment, the different levels of realization. All of that terminology is in Sufism, Tasawwuf. Yeah? It's in Tasawwuf, the journey, the stages, the ranks, the annihilation of the soul later on, nirvana at the highest level. And so these are things that really plague the discussion when people talk of Tasawwuf in Islam. There are two major schools. One says it's from Islam, originally and exclusively from Islam, and the other says no, it's not from Islam. It actually is an amalgamation of other traditions that was Islamified later on. Yeah? And again, we can be here forever discussing that. So he mentions that to say that from his perspective, it is from the former, it is from Islam. And he would say that because at the time he lived in North Africa, the entire region, and by the way, Islam, de facto Islam, for the majority of our history, was Tasawwuf driven. The majority of our history in most of our lands, up until now, by the way, it is Tasawwuf based. Islam is Tasawwuf, Tasawwuf is Islam. That's the reality. So living in 12th, 13th century North Africa and then dying in Egypt, he was actually the head of a Sufi lodge. So this was his reality. Now, of course, he would say it is part of Islam, because that's the reality at the time for everyone. Great men in Islam and women were all Sufis. Name them for me, I'll give you the names of them being Sufis. Salahuddin was a Sufi, for example. You had even Baybars, Qutuz, yeah? These mighty, fierce warriors were Sufis. Abdul Hamid II, in most recent time, was a Sufi. Umar was a Sufi. Sheikh Osman Dan Fodio was a Sufi. Shamil of Dagestan was a Sufi. Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was a Sufi. Keep going, okay? So the majority of Muslims in our history, whether we like this fact or we don't like it, it's a historical fact, we're all Sufis. That's just a reality. For them, Sufism was an extension of being a Muslim. In the same way, being a Sunni for them was an extension or category. So being a Hanafi or a Shafi'i or a Maliki or a Hanbali was an extension of Islam. It wasn't outside of Islam. It's part of being a Muslim. You have to pick a madhab. Likewise, you have to pick a tariqah. Right? So it was a reality for the majority of our ancestors, for the majority of our history up until recent times. And even now, if you took all the Muslims in the world and you did a poll and census, the majority of them are Sufi. Not necessarily practicing Sufis, but by culture and by association, the Islam they practice is Sufi Islam. Somalia, India, Nigeria, Algeria, Morocco. Keep going, right? Indonesia. The biggest Muslim nations with the longest history, Egypt, Iraq, all of them. You'll find shrines, you'll find house of veneration, you'll find Sufi turuq, you'll find zawiyat, khanqas, because that's the majority school when it comes to how Islam has been adapted, how it came to be known. Turkey, my family went to Turkey this recent holiday, and they were saying everywhere it's everybody's basically Tasawwuf is visible in Turkey. Let's put it that way. Right? The Ottoman Empire, it was a Sufi empire, and that was the longest lasting empire in Islam. Right? Same with the subhanallah, the Seljuk warriors, the Seljuk sultans, the Seljuk dynasty was converted to Islam through the medium of Sufi scholars. In the same way, Uthman Ghazi was also converted or was under the tutelage of a Sufi scholar. That was just a reality. That was just a reality. And so when Ibn Khaldun says this, the reality is in his time and before him and after him, Sufism was Islam. It was irrefutable for them. Now, the type of Sufism is a discussion here. Which type of Sufism? But Tasawwuf as a branch, as a science, was Islam for them. Again, it's only recently now, in the modern epoch, that Tasawwuf is a form of aberration. It is a deviation from the norm in some circles. It's only in modern times. That's the reality. Again, like it, don't like it, that's the reality. It's a historical fact. I would, for those who disagree or who want to, and it's okay to disagree, but I would request of you to give me 5 names pre-18th century, 5 names before the 18th century who were not Sufi, 5 prominent names, just 5. I'm talking about leaders, kings, sultans, right? Or nations that were not Sufi before the 18th century. Please, just give me those 5 names. Okay? Almost all of them. If they were not Shia, if they were Sunni, they were Sufi. That was the reality. And that was up until recently, and that's another story we can get into as to why that changed and what happened in the 19th century that made a turn for everything and people began to develop new ways. I'm not converted. I myself, I'm not Sufi, okay? I'm not bragging. Maybe something I should be lamenting because we are really in lack of spirituality. We are living in very materialistic times. We are very literalistic. We lack many of the traditions and disciplines that our ancestors had. So it's not something that I'm bragging about. I'm just telling you that I'm not a Sufi, but I can admit the truth when it comes to the history of Tasawwuf in Islam. It was, as they call it, the heart of Islam. Yeah? And for the longest time, that was standard Islam. The only question was, which tariqah do you belong to? That was it. Yeah? Brother servant or sister servant.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.
The question I have is, I mean, I've always known that all these scholars and everything came out of a Sufi background. Like you said, it's more their origins, or the culture itself. But when you see like how Sufis are seen now, like it's kind of, that's why a lot of people have difficulty accepting that all these prominent scholars and imams and everything were Sufis, because of the practice that's been, I think, changed with Sufism, or people using Tasawwuf for other reasons, like were they going too far into like sorcery and all these kind of things. Is that correct?
2 things, Barakallahu Fikum, 2 things. Number 1, the greatest critics of charlatans and false Tasawwuf were Sufis themselves. The greatest critics calling out charlatans and people who are not real were Sufis themselves. Look into their books. If you want a book criticizing the false practices and the bid'ah of Tasawwuf, look at the schools of the Sufi scholars. For example, in North Africa, As-Sanusiyya, the Sanusi tariqah, which is very prevalent in, first of all, North Africa, because it was established there. And that's where we have Umar al-Mukhtar as-Sanusi. But they also exported it to East Africa, in Sudan, and parts of West Africa. In Nigeria, you have the Sanusi branch as well. They were people who were extremely If you look at the books, how they describe them, they were very, very strict, very orthodox. They were Sufi orthodox in the sense that they only took Quran and Sunnah. Only Quran and Sunnah. And by the Ibn Khaldun himself, he describes Tasawwuf as Quran and Sunnah in the Muqaddimah. The way he describes it, wallahi, he says this way. It is from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from the Ijma'a of the three generations, the Sahaba, the Tabi'in, and those who come after them. That's how he describes Tasawwuf. And under that description, who can disagree with that? Yeah. So the greatest critics were Sufis. So the Sanusi branch, they're very, I mean, if I had to be a Sufi, I'd be a Sanusi. If I had to be a Sufi. Huh? If I had to be a Sufi, I would be a Sanusi. The original. They were tremendous human beings, honestly. At night, they were praying, making dhikr, wird, qiyam al-layl. In the daytime, they were fighting, mujahideen. Mujahideen by day, saints by night. That's how they were. Umar al-Mukhtar was one of many. He wasn't the only one. He was one of, there was one, the Sheikh who actually established it, his name was the Grand Sufi, the Grand Sanusi. The Grand Sanusi. They established universities, they established training camps. These were like, you could say, superheroes, quite frankly. People who worshipped Allah, like Zuhad. People who were constantly making dhikr, praying at nights. People who were reciting Quran every 3 days. Umar al-Mukhtar, every 3 days would complete Khatm of Quran, every 3 days. He never slept beyond the time of Tahajjud. He prayed all his prayers in the masjid, in Jama'ah. And his companion said, 30 years I've known this man, 30 years. He never missed the front row for Fajr and Isha, 30 years. And he would pray at night, Qiyam al-Layl. He wouldn't go to sleep after that. He would wait until Fajr. And he used to finish Khatm al-Quran every 3 days. And on top of all of that, one of the greatest mujahideen in the contemporary history of Islam. So again, when we talk of orthodoxy, we narrow it down too much. Okay, we narrow it down too much. That's one example. There are many other examples. Many other examples of, for example, let's go to Chechnya, Dagestan. Imam Shamil al-Dagestani was a Sufi master. Not just a Sufi master. A Sufi master, right? And one of the greatest 3 mujahideen in the 19th century. One of the 3 greatest, according to an American writer. He said there are 3 great human beings on the face of this earth today, and all 3 are Muslims. And he mentioned them. And all 3 were, of course, Muslim, Sufi. Imam Shamil al-Dagestani, I mean, just look at the warriors coming out of Dagestan today, right? Look at those people. And he was very austere. He was from the Naqshbandi order, which is known as the most sober form of Tasawwuf, very, very, very strict. And that's the only one that goes back to Sayyidina Abu Bakr. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you want to talk about orthodoxy, then you find it within the Sufis themselves. It is unfair to take the example of a few people who don't know what they're doing and to paint all Sufis with that, when in reality we have so many examples, wallahi, so many examples, when it comes to authentic Sunnah, people who are multazim, people who are very, very strong in the Sunnah, they come from the Tasawwuf tradition. And this is not something I'm saying myself. Look at the books of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, right? Look at his books when he talks about Tasawwuf. Look at his description of the real Sufis, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, right? I can go on. So we effectively do a disservice to the discussion when we come with caricaturesque arguments. I would extend it. Let's put it this way. If the Sufis of today are given a bad name of Tasawwuf and make people turn away from Tasawwuf, broaden it a bit more. The Muslims of today, are we giving a good example of Islam? If we go purely by the Muslims of today, the general Muslim mass, and the ignorance that we display and the things that we do, should anyone take Islam seriously? The answer would be, of course they should, because it's not about the Muslims, it's about Islam, right? So in the same way, if you were to say, because some Sufis do this, I don't take Tasawwuf seriously, it's not congruent. Because what you're saying is, I have one rule for Islam as a whole, which is, no matter how bad the examples are from the Muslims, Islam is always going to be separate. Look at it for what it is. But when it comes to Tasawwuf, I'm going to judge by the people who are giving the worst example. It's not fair. Quite frankly, it's not fair. So it requires deeper reading, because what we're doing here is, By dismissing this and by saying that all Sufis do this, and we dismiss everything that comes with the tradition, we are erasing history. We are erasing our own history. For those of us who are from the Muslim world, your own history, look at your own country of origin. I guarantee you, your great-grandfather, your great-grandmother must have been a Sufi. If they were Sunni, they were Sufi. Put your hand up if your great-grandfather or great-grandmother, if you are from the Muslim world originally, was not a Sufi. Chances are there were Sufis, because that was a prevalent form of Islam at the time. So we require a lot more substantial reading, really, and not just to be people who take the easy route out. Yes, you can go online, find images and videos of Sufis doing silly things, so-called Sufis doing silly things, and some things are outside of Islam. You can find that. But likewise, you could find people who are saying we are Orthodox Muslims, killing people, blowing themselves up, committing atrocities, right? When was the last time you saw a Sufi terrorist group? Please, somebody in the group tell me. When was the last time you saw a Sufi terrorist group, an Al-Qaeda from the Sufi camp? So we don't take those examples to represent the whole. That's what I'm trying to say here. Yeah. And I'm saying this as somebody who's not, I am not a Sufi. I keep repeating this, but I'm objective, I am fair, and I'm historically, I stick to the facts. That was the reality. And if you look into the classical texts, and there are many of them, they are more balanced about this. They're far more balanced about this. One of the best books I've read about Sufi Tasawwuf, in criticizing it, because there are, again, and let me repeat it for the 99th time, I am not a Sufi. I'm not saying that to denigrate Tasawwuf. I'm saying it as a statement of honesty. I am not a Sufi, but I am speaking from an objective perspective. There are more books written by Sufis criticizing the wrong practices than there are by non-Sufis. And those books by the Sufis are better than those by the non-Sufis. One of the best books I've ever read on this topic was by Ahmed Sirhindi. Tremendous book. Amazing book. It goes into so much detail. So much detail. And as a result of that, it's because they want to revive true Tasawwuf. They want to separate from what is being invented, what is folklore, what is effectively charlatans, from what is actual true Tasawwuf. And so they write books. They've written many books. You have to read the books. Even amongst, for example, let's say Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali, and we know where he is in terms of the rankings of Tasawwuf. He would write about certain Sufis of his day who took the wrong path, or who were not acting in the spirit of what was supposed to be Tasawwuf, right? Calling them out for their wrong practices. So there is no shortage of that material out there. It's a matter of reading widely with an objective mind and not just taking an easy way out, which is to say all Sufis worship graves, all Sufis dance in the masjid, all Sufis don't pray, all Sufis make shirk. That's a very simple way. You could say all Muslims are terrorists, all Muslims are backwards, all Muslims are anti-logic. It's the same thing pretty much, because you're taking one example and you're generalizing, and you don't want to hear the other perspective. You don't want to actually look at the details of what are Muslims saying about terrorism. What do Muslims say about terrorism? What do Muslims say about committing atrocities? Listen to the Muslims themselves. Right? So it's a matter of being just to the subject and not jumping to just taking easy ways out. Because Islamic history, by the majority of it, is all Sufi anyway, to be honest with you. The civilizations, the dynasties, the kingdoms, name them for me. If they're not Shia, they're Sufi. Name them for me. Even, let's look, for example, at the more extreme examples, such as the al-Murabitun. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, al-Murabitun, Sufi. These were actually not extreme, but the one that came after them was what? Al-Muwahhidun, the Al-Muhads, also Sufi. Let's go to Somalia. What they used to call, in derogatory terms, the British would call the Mad Mullah of Somalia, Said Hassan, the Mad Mullah, right? He had a Sufi movement, the dervishes, the Sufi dervish, and their movement, as-Salihiyya, that was a tariqah. Orthodox, according to the, obviously, they were very strict. When I say orthodox, I mean they were very strict. You have to believe what they believed in, very strict, very stringent, right? But these were things that were common across the Muslim world. Common. The Seljuks, as I said, the Salahuddin, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, right? The Mughals. Where do you want to stop? Right? So this was the majority of Islam for a long time, until the 19th century. Until the 19th century. Yeah. So we have to read a bit more beyond the gimmicks, quite frankly. We have to go beyond the gimmicks and be a bit more academically honest and rigorous, and not to go for the gimmicks, because there's a lot more to this. If you want to erase Islam by saying that Tasawwuf is invalid and all of it is non-Islam, delete 99% of your history then, because all of that is Tasawwuf. All of these men that we are proud to celebrate, and women, Tasawwuf. So delete all of that. You will be left with the 19th century, the latter part of that, and what we have today, the miserable era we live in today, the 20th century, 21st century. This is what it will look like, our history. Yeah. And you can judge for yourself. Are we living in a golden era right now? Is this a golden age of enlightenment for the Muslims? Are we the only generation of all the generations that came before who understand Islam properly? Logic would tell you otherwise. Okay, so let's move on a bit more. There's a bit more here. So when he talks of the three generations, the first generation, among those people who the Sufis count amongst the early proponents of Tasawwuf, even though the word Sufism did not exist, but they take these people as examples of Sufis, are Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, anhu, Abu Darda, and also Darda. There were two of them, Al-Kubra, the wife, and Al-Sughra, the daughter. Uwais al-Qarni. Uwais al-Qarni, a very pivotal Sahabi when it comes to Tasawwuf. Uwais al-Qarni is very interesting, actually. It's a very interesting figure. The Uwaisi link, or the Uwaisi tariqah, is one whereby you don't get to meet a sheikh in person, but you're connected to him despite not meeting him. And they take that principle from the principle that Uwais, although he never met Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in person, he was still his murid, he was still his companion, and there was a connection there. And so you can imagine, in a globalized world, there's a sheikh sitting in Konya somewhere, or maybe in Morocco, in Fez, and you are his students. You can still be connected to him because you have the Oasis link, right? You're from somewhere else, in America, for example. He's in Casablanca, and there's a connection there. So there's a lot of, the theory there goes a lot, very deep. But these are the companions, of all the companions, who typically are connected to. Now, of course, Sayyidina Ali, radiallahu anhu. Of course, Sayyidina Ali. But when it comes to Tasawwuf, in terms of the practice, these are the companions whose spirituality is usually pointed towards when it comes to the first generation. When we say, for example, and Ibn Khaldun says, there were people at that time who were practicing Tasawwuf, not in name, but in spirit, or in general terms. These are the companions here. Okay. Now, those that come after them, the second generation, Dhunnun al-Masri, Hassan al-Basri, Junaid al-Baghdadi, Rabi'a al-Adawiyya. Okay, these three were in Iraq, and Dhunnun was in Egypt. They are very famous in the second generation, third generation, who actually were. These are the people who actually started writing down the codes and the rules of Tasawwuf, right? These are the people who began to codify it, and the term Tasawwuf became known under these names. And there are others, Ibrahim al-Nakhai and many others. And then after them comes another generation where it's really refined. So now you have schools, specific schools. So you would say, I am of this, the Qadiri school. I am of this school. So it became a madhab, effectively. In the age where you had Al-Ghazali, for example, Ibn Arabi, Jalaluddin al-Rumi, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, perhaps the greatest of them, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. Okay, he was also in Baghdad. He was a Persian, but he traveled and died in Baghdad. And he establishes the Qadiri school. The Qadiri school. And from that school, many sub-schools were developed in India, in Africa, in North Africa. Many sub-schools from the main school of the Qadiri tariqah were developed. So these became heavyweights. So most of these turuq that people talk of in terms of Tasawwuf go back to these names: Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, and others. So it develops that way in the three generations, the three subsequent generations. And I mean, Tasawwuf, it is an ocean. There is so much there. It's so complicated, to be honest with you. It is so complicated. There are so many stages, so many different iterations, so many methods, so many paths, so many disciplines for the spirit, so many books to read. It is something that is vast. It is a vast ocean. And in that ocean, you can get lost, quite frankly. You can get lost. But there is a chronology to this, there is a history to it, and there is a reality to it as well. There is a reality to it, okay? And we have to be, we have to acknowledge the reality and not kind of dismiss it because we don't like the idea that maybe the majority of the Muslims were of Tasawwuf. So we just dismiss it with people dancing in the masjid, maybe praying to the graves. It's not as simple as that. In fact, I have a book. I have a book in my library that was printed and written and compiled and published by Zaki al-Yamani, who was the ex-finance oil minister of the first one, by the way, and the one who served under King Faisal, rahimahullah. Zaki al-Yamani, rahimahullah as well, he was a man who loved al-thaqafa, yeah, culture, adab, tarikh. So he established an institute in the UK, in I think there's a branch in Egypt. There may be one in Turkey. There's definitely one in Saudi Arabia. And they gather manuscripts and books and basically publish and preserve. Now, one of the books that he himself published with the help of many scholars is a book on the house of Khadija, al-Kubra bint Khuwailid in Mecca. I have the book here. And in the first couple of chapters, and remember, he's in Saudi Arabia at the time. He's from Saudi, well, he's from Yemen, but his career and his legacy is in Saudi Arabia. He, in the book, talks of people traveling to the house of Khadija. The entire book is about the house of Khadija, radiallahu anha. And he talks of people going to, in the book, I couldn't believe it, quite frankly. And he's giving, through the scholars working with him, various accounts from various classical scholars, heavyweights, with references, of people going to the house of Khadija, making tabarruk, literally going to the house of Khadija radiallahu anha, touching the walls for barakah, seeking the dust, wallahi. And I was like, subhanallah. I was shocked. Saudi Arabia, he's from the highest ranking. What is this? Okay, but it was historical information. And he said, and this this book is tremendous. It has the original, some of the dimensions of the house, various descriptions of the house, pictorial evidences, reconstructions, and it talks of this element of people going there, making ziyarah to the house of Khadija, and making tabarruk, touching the walls for barakah, taking the dust. I couldn't believe it. But the reality is, this was the reality for those people for the vast majority of our history. It's only recently that these things have become taboo, right? And these sites have been locked off. And the names that I was reading, the classicals, I couldn't believe the names I was reading, actually, from their works. So this is why history is so important. This is why history is so important. That was a reality at the time. Now, would I do that personally? No, I'll be honest with you. Because the way I've learned Islam in the West, I've grown up in the West, that's not the Islam I've come to know. So I would not go to the house of Khadija radiallahu anha, if it was still there, it's been converted now. I would not make tabarruk of the walls, but I would not deny it either. And I would not denigrate it, because I know that people who were far more knowledgeable and committed to Islam did that. And that's how they grew up. That's how they understood Islam. That's how the evidence came to them. That's how that's the information they had. And it's in their books. That's the most important thing. It's in their books. All right? That's a reality. Historic reality is there. So these are things that developed over a long time. And as I said, many big names. I'm talking about major big names. For example, and I'm just being honest with you here. It's an honest discussion group here. I'm talking to peers, people who maybe have gone through the same experience I have in the West, learning Islam from the Western sources and the Western paradigm. I'm actually developing myself further because I'm going back to the essence of Islam and learning from the original roots, traditionally speaking. But I'm not Sufi, just to repeat that again. But having said that, if you look at the original classical sources in the original Arabic, a lot of things are concealed in there. A lot of things are concealed. A lot of things are concealed and sanitized and hidden and shortened and abridged and removed and revised and rewritten and translated. So what you think is orthodoxy is not real orthodoxy. There is a greater orthodoxy. And it's only when you emerge out of that blindfolded, narrow-minded perspective of you know everything because it's translated for you, you begin to see the wider picture. And I tell you, the wider picture is so vast. It is so vast. And the history of the Tasawwuf is interesting because, again, it is the history of our ancestry, whether we like it or not. Whether we like it or not, all of those people you talk of, you brag about, you go back to, the majority of them, not all, the majority of them were following some sort of Sufi tariqah. The majority of them. So that requires serious study and not just caricaturesque kind of very surface level discussions and arguments. The reality is what we experience in the Western Hemisphere is a bubble. Our Islam is in a bubble. We think Islam globally is the way we see Islam where we are locally. That's not the reality. The anomaly is our Islam. How we have seen Islam is the anomaly, actually. In the broader sense, how people see Islam globally, our Islam is the anomaly. I know that personally because I travel. And when you go to Muslim majority countries, except for a few Muslim majority countries, you would see very clearly that they have a different perspective of Islam, completely different. When Syria was before the civil war, those who travel to Syria will tell you. Egypt, they'll tell you. Mauritania, they'll tell you, right? The reality is very clear. Yemen, they'll tell you. Okay? But it's because we have a very, maybe it's because we came to the West or we learned Islam in the West, we have a limited perspective on things. There's a limited perspective on things. And it may appear that because we are in that world, we can't see the bigger picture. And so we conceive that Islam is this way everywhere and for all time. And it has always been this way. And this was the only way Islam was actually practiced. But the reality, just look at the evidences, look at the history, look at the actual historical narrative and the historical context. Sit down when you have time, think of the 10 favorite people that you look up to in history. I'm not talking about the Sahaba, of course. Those that come afterwards. For the vast majority of our Islamic history, pick any empire and ask yourself, which system did they follow? Is it my system, the way I see Islam, or is it another system? Salahuddin, start with Salahuddin. That's a common name people want to mention. Start with him. Look into his spiritual discipline. Look into which path did he take? Right? And then work your way all the way down. Even in Al-Andalus, Ibn Khaldun was a Sufi, for example. Right? So you begin to paint a bigger picture of the world, and you have to ask yourself certain questions after that. Okay? Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, Majmu' al-Fatawa, he has an entire section there on Tasawwuf. Read that. Yes, of course, he does address the heterodox practices, the excess, the bid'ah, and sometimes the kufr in all of that. But he also mentions that we have mashayikhna, our elders from the people of Tasawwuf. He thinks very highly of Abdul Qadir al-Jalani, very highly. And his book, Sir al-Asrar, he thinks very highly of him. Read those books. It's not just a one-way street, black and white. They were able to distinguish between what was real. And in contemporary circles, there are some people in the West who are trying to bridge the gap. There are people who are trying to bridge the gap because we in the West, when I say we, I'm talking about a certain category of people. Those of us who learned Islam a certain way and I've grown out of it, but I can identify with it. And so they try to revive the spiritual element of Islam, but you can't use Sufi, Tasawwuf, you can't use that term. So instead they use the term Tazkiyah to nafs. It's the same thing, it's a different packaging, right? Tazkiyah to nafs. So that's another brand that's used to convey the same thing, but we can't use Tasawwuf because it's loaded. So we use Tazkiyah to nufus or Tazkiyah, same thing. Another piece of information for your personal study, I would say look into, because when I say the 19th century, I'm specific for a reason. I didn't say 17th century, 16th century, 20th, I said 19th century. Because there is a turning point in the 19th century from Paris and Egypt. This is where it begins. Paris and Egypt. Paris and Egypt. A movement happens, a turning of minds happens, a new movement arises in Paris and Egypt. That's where the turning point begins. Yeah.
Does it relate to Muhammad Abdu?
Yes.
Yes, and that's more or less what I was kind of getting at as well, just kind of pointing this out as far as exactly that what you're mentioning, and kind of like apologize for I guess not speaking very well, but that's kind of more or less what I mentioned of you mentioning earlier as far as from a Western perspective. I'm not saying that the rest of the world is kind of follows the same. That Tasawwuf of Sufism isn't present. I know it's very prominent in other, in the eastern side of the world. Now speaking more from the western side, as we kind of project again the soft power over the rest of the world, right? We tend to kind of project and kind of push ideas to the rest of the world. But yeah, I mean exactly, and that's exactly what I was alluding to as well as Muhammad Abdu, and I forget the other.
Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Sayyid Jamaluddin al-Afghani came before him.
Correct. Yes.
Rashid Rida.
Correct. Yes.
Rida.
So,
and his student was after Rashid Rida. There's a lineage here. There is a lineage. Jamaluddin al-Afghani. Then you have Muhammad Abdu. Then you have his student Rashid Rida al-Manar publication. Very, very pivotal publication in that time. Very. His interaction with the Ottoman Empire, we can go on for hours, but he had a student. So the lineage is, I've seen lectures of brothers giving lectures about Rashid Rida, radiallahu anhu, rahimahullah, and his life, and he was a tremendous man, a tremendous mind. But when they talk about his teachers, because you cannot cut him off from Muhammad Abdu, you can't cut him off. He was a direct disciple. And you could not cut him off from Sayyid Jamaluddin al-Afghani. You can't cut them off. You can't. It was a direct connection. However, what you can do is say, Rashid Rida, he repented, he reformed, he went back to proper Islam. The other two were misguided. That's a convenient way to shut the story down very quickly. No, you can't shut the story down that quickly because the lineage continues. Because at the time, there was a movement known as al-Thaqafa. This was a group of people who traveled. You have to go all the way back to the 19th century. It begins with Napoleon in 1798. Napoleon enters Egypt, and for 3 years, he's going around building hospitals, building army barracks, establishing, also stealing a lot of things as well. Manuscripts, relics. The Rosetta Stone was found in Rashidiyah. They brought it back to Paris and they cracked the code. 3 years later, in 1801, he's kicked out. When he's kicked out, a mercenary army comes in. The Ottomans send an army from the Balkans. Amongst that army is a young man, Muhammad Ali Pasha. Muhammad Ali at the time, Muhammad Ali. Became a Pasha later on. Muhammad Ali began to develop Egypt, especially Alexandria. One of the ways he did that was to send people from Egypt to Paris to study in Paris. In 1826, he sent a young man and a group of people, a young Azhari scholar. His name was Rifat. This is actually a higher level history I'm giving you for free. Do your own research. Rifat al-Tahtawi was a recently graduated 25-year-old Azhari scholar. And he was sent with the first delegation of Egyptian students, the first delegation from Egypt to Paris for 5 years, because Muhammad Ali wanted them to study Western science and to come back to Egypt and to build Egypt. But he didn't want them to lose their deen. So with every batch, he would send one Azhari scholar. So for the first batch, the scholar who went with them was Rifa' al-Tahtawi. Rifa' Rafi al-Tahtawi. And he goes for 5 years. While he is there, instead of being he was supposed to be the imam to keep them grounded in Islam, he became the biggest student of Western philosophy, ideas, literature, and culture. And he wrote an entire book. We still have it today. An Imam in Paris. Google it. An entire book he wrote. An Imam. When he comes back in 1831, Muhammad Ali puts him in charge of the biggest publication house in Egypt. And this man begins to translate all of the French classics, the new ideas, philosophy, sociology. He begins to translate in Arabic. And this movement created a new group of people in Egypt, al-Thaqafa. Al-Thaqafa are the people who, they are the cultured people. These are what we have. All of us, many of us today are of this group. We are Muslim, but we think we are intellectually advanced. We are modern. Amongst those people, al-Thaqafa, we have Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Rashid Rida, no Rashid Rida, he comes a bit later. He comes one step later. Muhammad Abdu. And both of these men also go to Paris and spend years in Paris. They become also Freemasons. They become Freemasons. So when they come back to Egypt and they come back to that region, they begin to tell people, we need to get rid of this Sufism. We need to get rid of this folklore Islam. We need to get rid of this connection with the shuyukh. We need to go back to the sources of Islamic tradition and law. What is that? Quran and Sunnah. So they said we need to go back to the sources, because at that time, the printing press was now in Egypt. I mean, I did an entire course on this, by the way, some years ago. An entire course. The first printing presses that came to Egypt were left by Napoleon and were later used by Muhammad Ali Pasha and Sheikh Rifa'. And they used the printing press. It's still there as a museum piece. And these were the first times where you had like classical text being printed en masse. And this group of people, al-Thaqafa, would read without teachers because they believed we are intellectual enough. We don't need to have a sheikh. We can read the hadith for ourselves, get the dalil for ourselves and the Quran. We just need Quran and Sunnah. And that's where the movement began. Now, Rashid Rida comes as a student of Muhammad Abdu. And he also follows the same methodology, although he's more orthodox. He's not as, because Muhammad Abdu and Jamaluddin, they had some strange beliefs. They have some strange beliefs. If you look at the tafsir of Muhammad Abdu, you'd be shocked. So they began to approach the text directly. Just Quran and Sunnah, just Quran and Sunnah. And so when Rashid Rida comes later, when he's the same generation, but he's a student of the student of the student, he has a printing press again. Al-Manar. Take all of these terms I'm telling you now, pause the video, Google it. I'm not making any of this up. Al-Manar Publications. And this publication was for two reasons. Number one, to revive the Muslims, because at the time the Ottoman Empire is down, things were going down for the Muslims. He wanted to revive the Muslim spirit. Secondly, focusing on the hadith, because again, his teachers were saying we need to go back to the sources of things. Forget all of this traditional religion, traditional Islam, these turuq. And at that time, there were many Sufi tariqas that were really corrupt, quite frankly. And we're not concerned with proper, authentic sources. It was all about khurafat, to be very fair and honest. So this then drew the attention of a young man who was at the time in a Zahiriya library in Damascus. Right? You can do the research for yourself. So there's a long history. So the point being, after that, things happen in Saudi Arabia. 79, we have Juhayman enters the Kaaba. He besieges it. There's a revolution in Iran. And so there is a new, there's an impetus, there's a need to propagate the Saudi da'wah, effectively, quite frankly, I'll be honest with you. And because of the oil revenues that were generated, it's all just so convoluted. You know, in 79, Juhayman seizes the Kaaba, and this causes a crisis in the Muslim world. In the same year, Khomeini becomes effectively the leader of the Republic of Iran, and he establishes his own Shia Khilafah, effectively, Wilayat Faqih. And so the Saudis, King Fahd at the time, had a problem because he had to show the world that he was able to, no, King Khalid, King Faisal, King Khalid, King Fahd, King Khalid at the time had a problem. He had to show the world we are competent to be guardians and stewards of the Kaaba, right? But that was a major fiasco. While next door the Shia are celebrating that we are the real leaders of the Muslim Ummah, because look what we've achieved. And so they had to double down and show that we are the premier, we are the leading land of Islam. From 79 onwards, that was the agenda, which is why you have many publications coming out and translations coming out. It was a race to have more influence globally. And those in the West were the most susceptible because we don't have access to Arabic. And because in the 80s, from 1980 to 1988, 89, there was the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, this is how interlinked everything is. The Iran-Iraq war, it meant that Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries, Kuwait, Qatar, these GCC countries, while Saddam was fighting with Khomeini, right? Neither of those countries, neither Iraq or Iran, who at the time Iran had something like 13% of the world's oil, and I think Iraq had 6%, something like that. So together about 20%. Saudi had 21% of the world's oil. So they couldn't trade. Iraq couldn't trade, neither could Iran. They could trade, but not the way they would be able to trade. So the impact on the oil markets just increased the price of oil. And Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Qatar profited a great deal. That's when Fahd came into power, King Fahd, and he was able to realize so much wealth at that time. The nation became so wealthy because of the war next door, and the oil prices just shot up. So that oil revenue, ironically, was also invested in books and institutes and university packages for foreign students to study in Saudi Arabia. And then the publications, if you look at the publications in the 90s, 80s and 90s and early 2000s, you can't compare. Those were free books. The books being printed and being distributed were free. The other books you have to buy and pay for. Look at the Quran Masahif in the masjid if you're in the West. The majority of them, based on where you're praying, the majority of them are Saudi printed. So the resource was greater, the influence was greater, and they had more graduates who were able to come and study for free effectively and have bursaries, all expenses paid for pretty much. And so it's not equally yoked when it comes to the influence, but back home, it won't be equally yoked, right? And that's why we have, so I'm starting from the 19th century onwards, that's the trajectory. So if you were born in the year 1980 onwards, and you were in the West, chances are you're learning Islam from that perspective. Chances are that's the Islam you're going to learn, right? You're going to be more affected by that Islam than it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how I grew up. Nothing wrong with that. But that's the history of it. So when you're looking at the world that way, and you assume that that's the only form of Islam that's valid, it is because of the time you were born in. You were born in a specific time, under certain circumstances. And that is the only perspective you could see as being Islam. But for those who study and look at the history, there's a lot more. There really is a lot more. It's not that simple. And I suspect, and this is my projection, it doesn't have to be true, but I suspect, quite frankly, because Saudi Arabia right now is turning the corner. The Project of 79, MBS has said it very openly many times, he wants to return to pre-79. He wants to return to before the Kaaba was besieged, before the fiasco, the PR catastrophe. He wants to go back to before, when Saudi was more relaxed, was more open to the world. Women could drive, people were open. He wants to go back to that.
There is a widespread perception that the kind of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia is harsh, it's strict, it's intolerant. Is there any truth to that?
After 1979, that's true. We were victims, especially my generation, that suffered from this a great deal.
The Crown Prince traces most of Saudi Arabia's problems to the year 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini established an Islamic theocracy next door in Iran. The same year, religious extremists in Saudi Arabia took over Islam's holiest site, the Grand Mosque in Mecca. In order to appease their own religious radicals, the Saudis began clamping down and segregating women from everyday life.
What has been this Saudi Arabia for the past 40 years? Is that the real Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely not. This is not the real Saudi Arabia. I would ask your viewers to use their smartphones to find out. And they can Google Saudi Arabia in the 70s and 60s, and they will see the real Saudi Arabia easily in the pictures.
What was Saudi Arabia like before 1979.
We were living a very normal life, like the rest of the Gulf countries. Women were driving cars, there were movie theaters in Saudi Arabia, women worked everywhere. We were just normal people, developing like any other country in the world until the events of 1979.
And in doing so, he's reducing the impact of the da'wah that was promoted by Fahd and those that came after him. He's reversing that. So you find the curriculum in Saudi Arabia, for example, he has pushed laws to reduce the amount of time spent studying religion, for example, and increased and promotes critical thinking, right? And he wants people to think more critically and less ideologically speaking. Certain books have been sanitized. And so I suspect, it's just a theory I have, that as that chapter in Saudi history closes and we have more material, as in the 8th century what happened, as Ibn Khaldun says in Baghdad, there is more material and there are more entertainments and there are more physical things, material things for people. There may be a revival of Tasawwuf. That's what I believe personally. But also, as the money is drying up and the path and the funds are drying up in the Western Hemisphere, and there isn't the same advantage that there was before with the finance. There was a financial advantage, let's be honest. I suspect there will be a vacuum of da'wah, and that vacuum will have now the opportunity to be filled by people of other perspectives. And I think the Tasawwuf will take a hold there. I really believe that. Yeah, that's what I believe. In the next 20, 25 years, there's going to be a reversal of the order, and you will find more people talking about Tasawwuf in the West, especially. And who knows where that will lead to. Yeah, but that's the history. That's the history in a very short nutshell. And that's why, if you're from the West and you've learned Islam that way, I don't blame you. I don't blame you, because you are the product of a situation that arrived and was prevalent, and the market forces, quite frankly, made it such that one form of da'wah was more prevalent. It's as simple as that. However, going back to where we are, let's come back to this topic here. The reason why it may come as strange to the Western ear to hear these things in the Muqaddimah, or to hear the idea that Tasawwuf as a system, is because many of us have known Islam in a certain paradigm. And like I have said, in the next 25 to 30 years, that paradigm is shifting. We've already seen in the last 5 years. That paradigm is shifting. If this shift is fully implemented and it's fully successful, you will find a shift also in the da'wah. Inevitably, you're going to find a shift in the da'wah. The question here is, where will it lead to? Where do people go outside of this? Once the da'wah shifts focus, doesn't have the same financial backing, doesn't have the same support in the base, because MBS actually is anti-Salafiyah in the sense of the project that was established in 79, he's anti that. And there are many conferences and interviews he gives where he says, we will destroy this ideology. I'm not making it up. Again, if you think I'm lying, challenge me.
Your Highness, you have an incredibly beautiful country. You have the resources, but you are having radical ideas, some might say. Recently, you've announced that you will soon allow women to drive. You are allowing foreign investment in your beautiful country. Why now? What triggered this change in thinking?
First of all, I don't want to get out of this topic and discuss politics outside of the scope of today, but I'll just be very brief. Saudi Arabia was not like this prior to 79. Saudi Arabia and in the entire region, you have the awakening project spread after 79 for many reasons. Today is not the right day to discuss them. We were not like this in the past. We only want to go back to what we were, the moderate Islam that is open to the world, open to all the religions. Seventy 70% of the Saudi people are less than 30 years old. And quite frankly, we will not waste 30 years of our lives in dealing with extremist ideas. We will destroy them today. We want to live a normal life, a life that translates our moderate religion, our good customs. We coexist and live with the world and contribute to the development of our country and the world. This is something that there are steps that we have taken in the past that are clear. I believe that we will eradicate the rest of extremism very soon. So I don't think this is a real challenge, because we represent the moderate teachings and principles of Islam, and we have the right. The right is on our side, and everything that we deal with. So I don't think that we are concerned.
Thank you, Your Highness.
Many, where he says 79 was a turning point for us, and we are going back to pre-79 Saudi Arabia, where women can be seen in public. We were free and open society. Look at your phones. Look at before 79. His 2030 mission is to revert back to that. Now, in that pre-79 society, this movement does not exist there. It was a reaction to Juhayman's daring siege of the Kaaba, but also it was a counter-reaction to the Shia revolution in Iran. Literally, that's where it's heading. So my question is, once the project is complete, where does that leave the Salafi Dawah and those who were weaned on Salafiyah, who know nothing else but Salafiyah? When the financial backing is removed, when the support is removed, the support base is removed, when it becomes even dangerous and risky to challenge or to champion the movement, even in Saudi Arabia, because MBS is his policy is very clear, quite frankly, very clear about this. Where does that leave the people who grew up on this in the West? And my theory is traditional Sufi-based Islam will have a revival. That's why I believe it's going to fill the space. It's going to fill the gaps. Yeah, 25, 30 years from now. That's what I see. Yeah, and let's see what happens. But so far we're seeing rapid transformation. Rapid transformation. If you look at the da'wah scene, for example, in the last 15, 20 years, the voice is dominating the da'wah scene and the type of da'wah that was being delivered compared to today. If you lived 20 years ago, it's a completely different dynamic, completely different. What's happening? There is a shifting of gears, there's a turning of directions, and there is a new perspective, a new paradigm. Those of us who are actually a bit older do a bit more reading, we read a bit broadly, so we see a bigger picture of Islam, a different perspective of Islam. And when you read into history, that's just really what opens everything up for you, quite frankly. Read beyond the 19th century. That's all you have to do. Just go beyond the 19th century, right? And look at the historical catalog. Everything makes sense after that. Yeah. So I've gone on a long rant. Apologies. But it's relevant here because, again, I don't want you to read this and think Ibn Khaldun is off on one. He's talking about weird sects. No. What he was describing was at the time modus operandi. This was what everyone was doing. It was the reality of Tasawwuf. And it resembles our modern reality because when he cites the 8th century, which coincides with Baghdad, this mega city with a lot of technology, a lot of wisdom, a lot of resource, Tasawwuf grew in that environment. When we look at modern nations today that are developing rapidly, that's why I say I believe it's going to have a revival because there has to be a balance. There has to be civilizational balance. If there is excessive material focus and development, there has to be a spiritual grounding to balance that off. And so I compare Baghdad in the 8th century to the modern day certain Muslim nations that are developing rapidly. That's why I say I believe that gap that is being created will be filled by Sufism. Yeah. And Allah knows best. That's my theory anyway.